The fog had been pressing at the windows of the Horticultural Society's exhibition rooms since mid-morning, turning the gaslight amber and thick. And Isabel Merrick stood at the edge of a glass display case with her hands folded in front of her and her face arranged in the expression she had spent 2 decades perfecting. Attentive, pleasant, entirely composed. The 2 elderly gentlemen to her left had not noticed her. They had not noticed much beyond the case itself, and the botanical illustrations arranged inside it, and the extraordinary pleasure they were taking in telling each other how extraordinary those illustrations were. One of them, the stouter of the 2, tapped the glass with a gloved finger and said that he had never seen the leaf venation of a Camellia japonica rendered with such anatomical precision in his 40 years of attending these exhibitions. The other agreed, and added that the hand behind the initials I.M. was, in his considered opinion, the finest hand in Europe. Isabel permitted herself, for exactly 1 moment, to feel the full weight of that. The work was hers. The room did not know it. She had lived inside that particular silence for 19 years, and she had made her peace with it, or believed she had, until this moment, when the piece cracked open just far enough to let in something that felt, unexpectedly, like pride. She was still holding that feeling, turning it over quietly inside herself, when a voice behind her spoke her name. Not Miss Merrick, not the formal address of a man who had lost the right to anything else. Just Isabel. Said the way you say a word you have not spoken aloud in a very long time, but have never once forgotten how to pronounce. She turned. Alexander Kestrel, Duke of Rothmere, was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has stopped expecting to see. He was 55 now. The years had settled into him differently than she had imagined. She had imagined, in her weaker moments, that they might have been unkind, and they had not been. His hair had gone to silver at the temples, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there at 33. But he was still recognizably himself, which was the thing she had not prepared for. She had prepared, in some vague theoretical way, for the possibility of encountering him in London. She had not prepared for him to still be Alexander. He said, quietly enough that only she could hear it through the murmur of the room, "I waited for you." Isabel held his gaze for 3 full seconds before she answered. When she did, her voice was even. "How long have you known the initials were mine?" she asked. He did not look away. "I have only ever hoped," he said. "I confirmed nothing until this evening, when you turned around." The 2 elderly gentlemen had moved on to the next case. Around them, the exhibition rooms hummed with the soft collision of good coats and careful conversation. And no one was watching. And the fog pressed at the glass, and Isabel understood that she had approximately 30 seconds before the composure she had spent 22 years constructing would require active maintenance. "You have purchased the translations," she said. It was not a question. "Everyone," he said, "as they were published." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "I am glad the afternoon has been instructive for you, Your Grace." And she moved away through the crowd without giving him leave to follow. He did not follow. She noticed that too. That evening, in the 2 hired rooms she kept on Chandler Street, Isabel sat at the small writing desk with a lamp burning low and a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink. And she made herself think clearly. She was in London for a specific purpose. The Merrick townhouse on Bellamy Street had stood shuttered for 22 years, maintained at minimal expense by a solicitor's arrangement that her uncle had established before he left for Genoa, and the time had come to close it properly, to sort her father's remaining papers, settle the last of the accounts, and put the building on the market. She had given herself a fortnight. She had not given herself any additional complications, and she did not intend to accept any. The decision, when she arrived at it, was simple. She would finish the work on Bellamy Street and leave London within the fortnight. Whatever Alexander Kestrel had been waiting for, he would continue to wait for it, because she was not the woman he had left standing in a garden at 23. She had built something out of what that garden had cost her, and she was not going to hand it back for the price of one quietly spoken sentence in a fog-bound exhibition room. She went to bed resolved, and she slept better than she had expected, which she took as confirmation that the resolution was the correct one. The following morning she arrived at Bellamy Street with a key that had stiffened in the years since anyone had used it, and she stood on the front step for longer than she intended before the lock finally yielded. The rooms inside were sheeted and gray. The furniture sat in its shrouds like the suggestion of furniture, and the air held the particular stillness of a place that has been waiting without knowing what it is waiting for. Isabel moved through the entrance hall and the front parlor with her coat still on, pulling sheets aside to assess what lay beneath, making notes in the small book she carried. She was methodical about it. She had learned to be methodical about most things. It was in the back hallway, passing the door to what had been her father's study, that the memory arrived without warning. 22 years ago. The garden of the old house in Surrey, where the Merricks had spent 2 summers before the bank began to fail. She had been helping with the rose canes. Not because she was particularly useful, but because Alexander had been there, and she had been 23 and not yet skilled at manufacturing reasons to be in the same room as a person she was trying not to love. He had reached past her to pull a cane back from the trellis, and the thorn had caught her hand instead of his, and they had both laughed at it, at the smallness of it, at the sudden nearness. And he had taken her hand in both of his to look at the prick, and she had been aware, in that moment, of the exact temperature of his palms, and of the fact that neither of them was laughing anymore, before either of them had understood what was coming. Before the bank collapsed, and the partners' fraud came to light, and the old Duke made his position clear, Isabel set the memory down the way you set down something heavy that you have been carrying long enough to know better. She went to the cellar stairs and descended to begin work on her father's papers. 3 days later, a cart arrived at the front of the Bellamy Street townhouse, carrying 4 men and a quantity of timber, accompanied by a note written in a hand she had not seen in 2 decades, but recognized without hesitation. The note explained that the roof above the east wing was failing at the parapet, a fact that had been reported to the Duke of Rothmere's estate office by the neighboring property's surveyor, and that he was sending men to address it, as neighbor to the estate, and in the interest of preventing damage to the party wall. He had signed it with his name and nothing else. Isabel read it twice. She stood in the front hallway with the note in her hand and thought about the roof, which she had not yet inspected and which she now understood she should have. And she thought about what it would cost to refuse the offer and hire her own men in the time she had remaining. And she thought about the fact that he had framed the offer in the one way she could not decline without being actively foolish about it. She sent a reply accepting the arrangement. She did not add anything beyond the acceptance. He came himself 2 days later to supervise the work. She heard the men's voices from the upper floor and came down to find him on the front step, speaking to his foreman about the parapet, and they stood within arm's reach of each other for the first time since the exhibition rooms, without other people pressing around them on all sides. "The east side is worse than the surveyor's report indicated," Alexander said when she appeared at the door. "The north parapet is holding, but I would recommend having it repointed before winter." "Thank you," Isabel said. "I will pass that recommendation to the solicitor." He looked at her for a moment. He did not ask to come in. He turned back to the foreman and continued his instructions. And she went back inside, and she did not cancel the arrangement. He called at Bellamy Street 4 times over the following week, each time with a credible pretext: a question about the window frame in the study, a message from the solicitor's office that had been misdirected to Rothmere House, a sample of matching mortar for the parapet work that he wanted her to approve before the men used it. Each time, Isabel received him in the front parlor, which she had uncovered and made functional, and offered him tea, which he sometimes accepted and sometimes declined. And they spoke. It was strange, the speaking. She had expected it to be harder, had expected the accumulated weight of 22 years to make ordinary conversation feel like walking through standing water. Instead, the old ease returned before either of them intended it, which was perhaps more unsettling than difficulty would have been. He told her about his late wife, Margaret. 8 years dead now, a woman he described with the particular careful honesty of someone who had loved a person without being in love with them, and knew the difference, and was not ashamed of either fact. He asked about Lucca, and she told him about the botanical garden there, and the collection of Tuscan flora she had spent 4 years cataloging, and the translator's work that had begun as a commission and become a vocation. He told her about his own amateur work in botanical classification, tentative, self-deprecating about its limitations, genuinely interested in her corrections when she offered them. The Linnaean system has always seemed to me to describe the world as it wishes to be organized, Isabel said during one of these conversations, rather than as it actually grows. That is an argument I have been attempting to make to the Royal Society for 6 years, Alexander said, in considerably more words and to considerably less effect. She found, to her own annoyance, that she was almost smiling. Lady Honoria called on a Thursday afternoon, when the parlor had been made presentable enough to receive a visitor who was clearly conducting an inspection rather than a social call. She was 31, Alexander's daughter by his marriage to Margaret, and she had her father's steadiness and her mother's precision. And she looked at Isabel across the tea things with an expression that was not quite hostile and not quite warm, and was very clearly evaluating. She said very little directly. What she said was this: "My father is not a man who is easily persuaded to revisit the past, Miss Merrick. I find it interesting that you appear to be an exception." Isabel set her cup down. "I have not persuaded him to anything, Lady Honoria. He sent men to repair a roof that was failing. I accepted the help because the alternative was impractical." "Quite," said Lady Honoria, and smiled, and finished her tea and left. The smile had contained the warning as neatly as a letter contains a blade. Isabel understood it without needing it repeated. The invitation to Rothmere House came framed as a professional courtesy. Alexander had a collection of botanical specimens he believed might be of interest to a translator working in the field, and he would be grateful for her opinion on the provenance of several recently acquired drawings. Isabel accepted on the same terms on which the invitation had been offered. The library at Rothmere House was a long room with south-facing windows and the smell of old binding and good beeswax, and it was full of the kind of organized accumulation that suggested a man who read seriously and often. Alexander showed her the specimens. They were interesting, and she said so, and they spent 40 minutes discussing them with the focused pleasure of two people who care about the same things and rarely find someone else who does. And then he took her to one wall of the library, where a single shelf ran the full length between 2 windows, and she saw them. 19 volumes. Her translations, her illustrations, arranged in order of publication, their spines aligned with the precision of a man who had given them a specific place and kept them there. "I purchased them as they were published," Alexander said. "The first in 1844, the most recent last autumn." Isabel stood in front of the shelf and did not speak. She was aware of the volumes as a specific weight, not of paper and binding, but of 19 years of being watched from a distance by someone she had believed had stopped looking. She counted the spines without touching them. 19 years of work. 19 years of his knowing, or suspecting, or hoping, and saying nothing. She was aware distantly that her breathing had changed. "I would like to leave now," she said. "Of course," Alexander said, and walked her to the door without pressing her for a response she was not ready to give. 3 weeks after that visit, on a mild afternoon when the workmen had finished for the day and the townhouse was quiet around her, they were standing in the small garden behind Bellamy Street, where she had been assessing what remained of the old plantings. She was explaining the difference between a Rosa gallica and a Rosa centifolia. Not because he did not know, but because they had fallen into the rhythm of speaking about plants as a way of speaking about other things. When he reached across and brushed a strand of ash-gray hair away from her face. The same instinctive gesture she remembered. The same hand, 22 years older, and steadier than it had been at 33. She did not pull away. Neither of them mentioned it afterward. But she stood in the garden for a long time after he had gone, looking at nothing in particular, and she did not pick up her notebook again that afternoon. The fire began in the cellar of the Merrick townhouse on a Tuesday night in late October, sometime after 11 o'clock. A lantern left too close to a stack of her father's older papers, or a coal that had escaped the small grate she had been using against the damp. She never determined which. Alexander's men, working by standing order on the parapet, were first to reach it. One of them ran for help while the others began carrying boxes up the cellar stairs by the light of their own lanterns. And by the time Isabel arrived from Chandler Street, the smoke was still dense, but the fire itself had been beaten back before it took hold of the structural timbers. Alexander arrived on Bellamy Street past midnight, with ash on his coat. "The papers," Isabel said, as soon as she saw him. She was not asking about the building. "Most of them," he said. "The men got the majority out. There is a section at the back of the cellar that is smoke-damaged but not destroyed. We should go through it now, before the damp gets into what the fire left." They worked side by side through the rest of the night, in the smoke-stained cellar by lantern light, sorting her father's remaining papers into what was salvageable and what was not. They did not speak much. There was a particular quality to working beside someone in a crisis, the way the ordinary negotiations of proximity dissolve, the way two people stop performing for each other and simply do the necessary thing. And Isabel was aware of it without wanting to examine it. Outside the smoking house, near 4 in the morning, she was standing on the front step with a stack of salvaged folders when she realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, the fear had passed. From the cold and the sustained effort and the accumulated hour, and from the fact that she was 52 and had been working without pause since midnight. Alexander came out behind her and without a word removed his own coat and set it over her shoulders. Her hands were too full of papers to refuse it, and he did not wait to see whether she would. He went back inside to continue with the boxes. She stood on the step for a moment with his coat warm around her and her father's papers in her arms, and the sky beginning, very faintly, to thin toward dawn. Near 5 o'clock, among the last of the rescued boxes, She opened a leather ledger she had not seen before. Narrower than the account books she recognized, and bound differently, with a solicitor's mark on the spine that was not the Merrick family firm's mark. She opened it on the cellar floor by lantern light and began to read. Figures. Dates. The name of an intermediary firm she did not recognize, and then did one of the city's quieter legal practices, the kind that handled arrangements meant not to be traced directly. A private payment, substantial, made in the year of her father's ruin, to the remaining creditors of the Merrick Bank. The sum was large enough that she read it twice to be certain she had understood the figure. And at the bottom, in the solicitor's notation, a reference to a secondary arrangement, a post in Genoa, secured through the Duke of Rothmere's commercial connections for a Mr. William Merrick, to take effect upon the settlement of the outstanding debts. Her uncle, who had gone to Genoa the year after the collapse and built a respectable trading position there, and never explained to anyone exactly how he had managed to do it. She looked up. Alexander was standing at the foot of the cellar stairs with a box in his hands, watching her. He had not moved to take the ledger from her. She looked at him across the smoke-darkened room, the lantern between them, the ledger open in her lap, and she did not say anything at all. He set the box down and waited. The following evening, in the Rothmere House library, the ledger lay open on the table between them. Isabel had brought it herself. She had asked to come, and he had received her without comment. Now they were seated across from each other in the lamplight, and she looked at him and asked the question plainly. "Did you pay my father's debt?" she asked. He answered without hesitation, "Yes." He did not qualify it, and he did not look away. "The full sum recorded in that ledger," Isabel said. "The creditors and my uncle's post." He held her gaze. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The fire in the grate made a small sound. Outside, a carriage passed on the street, and then the room was still again. "Then I need you to explain something to me," she said. "For 22 years, I have believed that you made a choice. That when your father told you the Merrick connection would damage the dukedom's credit, you weighed what we had against what you stood to lose. And you chose the rank. I built my understanding of what happened on that belief. I built rather a great deal on it." "Isabel, I am not finished," she said quietly. "You paid a significant portion of your own inheritance to settle debts that were not yours. You arranged a position for my uncle that allowed my family to rebuild with something that resembled dignity rather than disgrace. And then you said nothing. Not a word. Not a letter. You allowed me to leave England believing you had simply not wanted me enough to fight for me." She paused. "Why?" Alexander was still for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, as if he were choosing each word for its accuracy rather than its effect. "I thought," he said, "that silence was the kindest shape protection could take. If you had known I paid the debt, you would have felt obligated. You would have come back, or believed you ought to. Not because you wanted to, but because the weight of what I had done would have made it feel like the only honorable response. I did not want that. I wanted you to be free to build whatever life you chose." Isabel looked at him across the ledger. Something in her expression had shifted. Not toward anger, exactly, but toward a precision that was harder than anger. "Kindness I was never told about," she said, "was never kindness meant for me." She held his gaze without wavering. "It was kindness designed to spare yourself the sight of what your obedience had cost. If you had told me, You would have had to watch me decide. And if I had decided to go anyway, if I had taken the knowledge of what you paid and still chosen Luca and my own work and my own name, you would have had to live with that. This way, you kept the version of the story where your sacrifice was complete and unwitnessed, and you never had to find out whether it was enough. The room went very quiet. Alexander did not speak for a long time. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has just heard the true thing said aloud for the first time and recognized it not because it was new, but because he had been avoiding it for 22 years. "You are right," he said at last. The words were simple, and he did not dress them in anything. She looked at the ledger. She looked at his hands, resting on the table's edge. After a silence that lasted long enough for the fire to settle in the grate, she reached across the open pages and let him take her hand. His fingers closed around hers carefully, as if she were something he did not intend to hold too tightly. Neither of them released the other until the fire burned low and the room had grown cold around them. She withdrew after that night. Not dramatically. She did not slam doors or send letters. She simply stopped calling at Rothmere House, and she quietly instructed the solicitor to suspend the sale of the Bellamy Street townhouse pending further review, without explaining the reason to anyone, including herself. She went back to her work on her father's papers. She told herself she needed time to think, and that was true. And it was also true that she was frightened in a way she had not been frightened in 20 years, and she did not particularly want to examine the shape of the fear. Lady Honoria came to Bellamy Street on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the library night. She had heard about the ledger from a solicitor's clerk. Isabel could not determine which one, and it did not ultimately matter. And she arrived without sending a card ahead, which told Isabel everything she needed to know about the nature of the visit before Honoria had said a word. "I will be direct with you, Miss Merrick," Honoria said, standing in the front parlor without having accepted the offer of a seat. "My father is not a young man, and he is not, despite appearances, an invulnerable one. He has spent the better part of his life managing a grief he never named, and he has done it quietly and without complaint. And I will not stand by while someone uses an old document to reopen damage for purposes I am not yet certain of." Isabel set down the folder she had been holding. She met Honoria's eyes directly. "I found the ledger in a box of my own father's papers," she said, "in the cellar of my own family's house, during a fire that your father's men helped to contain. I brought it to him and asked him whether what it recorded was accurate. He confirmed that it was. I then told him that allowing me to believe for 22 years that he had chosen rank over me, when the truth was more complicated than that, had not been a kindness to me, whatever he intended it to be. That is the whole of what occurred between us." She paused. "I have not asked your father for anything, Lady Honoria. I have not suggested that his payment creates an obligation. I have not sought to benefit from his choices in any material way. What I did was ask for an honest accounting of something that shaped the last 2 decades of my life, and I received one." Honoria regarded her for a long moment. Whatever she had been prepared to say next did not come. The plainness of it, the complete absence of defensiveness or performance, left her without a foothold. "I see," she said at last. "I hope so," Isabel said without rancor. Honoria left without pressing further. That same week, Isabel booked passage back to Bath on the Thursday coach. She did not tell Alexander. She told the solicitor, and she arranged for the remaining papers to be catalogued by a trusted firm. And she packed her trunk with the efficiency of a woman who had learned to move between cities without accumulating more than she could carry. On the morning of her departure, she rose early and had her trunk brought down and was waiting in the inn yard in the cold when she heard his voice. He had come himself. He was standing in the coaching inn yard in a coat that had not been designed for standing in inn yards at 7 in the morning. And the ostlers were looking at him with the particular curiosity reserved for dukes who appeared in unexpected places. He did not appear to notice them. "I am not asking you to stay," he said. "I am asking you to come and see the garden before you decide anything final. 1 hour. If you still want to go afterward, I will not follow you to Bath." Isabel looked at him across the yard. Her trunk was already loaded. The horses were being brought around. 1 hour, she said. The walled garden behind Rothmere House was in its last autumn color. The roses cut back for the season, the stone paths edged with a precision that spoke of long-standing, careful attention. Isabel walked through the gate behind Alexander and stopped. She knew this garden. Not this garden specifically. She had never been to Rothmere House before the past weeks. But she knew its layout with a certainty that arrived in her body before her mind had processed it. The placement of the central bed, the stone bench against the south wall, the climbing rose trained along the east-facing trellis in the pattern she remembered from the Surrey garden, from 22 years ago, from the afternoon of the thorn prick and the laughter. "You planted it to the same pattern," she said. "By standing order," Alexander said. "Maintained without alteration. The head gardener has instructions that predate his employment here." She walked slowly to the stone bench and stood in front of it. On the bench, stacked with care, were 22 journals. Cloth-bound, each one different. Different colors, different sizes, as if they had been acquired one at a time, over years, without a plan for accumulation. She looked at them and then looked at him. "1 per year?" he said. "I wrote in them only on certain dates. Your birthday. The day the match was broken. The day I received word that you had left for Lucca." He was quiet for a moment. "The day the first volume of translations was published. And I read the initials on the title page, and sat with them for an hour before I let myself believe what I suspected." Isabel reached out and touched the cover of the nearest journal without opening it. The cloth was worn at the corner, the way things wear when they are handled regularly and with care. "I never intended for you to read them," Alexander continued. "That was not the point of them. The point was—" He stopped. He tried again. "Keeping the garden and writing to a woman who would never receive the letters was the only way I knew how to go on loving you without asking anything of you in return. It felt, for a very long time, like the most honest thing I could do." He paused. "I understand now that it was also the easiest. I could love you in private, without ever having to face what my silence had taken from you. The journals cost me nothing I was not already paying. Telling you the truth would have cost me the story I had been telling myself, that I protected you, and that protection was the same as love." Isabel looked at the stack of journals and did not speak. "I am not asking your forgiveness," he said. "I am asking something harder than that." He looked at her steadily, with the same quality of attention she had first felt in the exhibition rooms, as if she were something he had stopped expecting to see and had not yet stopped being surprised by. At 55 and 52, after all of this, the silence, the ledger, the things we have said in the last weeks that cannot be unsaid, I am asking whether we might try the harder thing, not being remembered, being known. Isabel looked at him for a long moment. The garden was quiet around them, the autumn light thin and clear, the rose canes bare against the wall. Then she took his face in both hands and kissed him. Not as a response to what he had said, not as an answer to any of it, as the first thing that had passed between them in the whole of this long season that was not a confession or a question or a reckoning, but simply itself, warm and certain and long overdue. He went very still for a moment, the way a man goes still when something he has stopped expecting arrives without announcement. Then his hands found her shoulders, and he held on. 1 year later, the walled garden was in its first summer bloom. The roses on the east trellis had come into full color, deep pink against the old stone, and the evening light was the particular quality of early June that makes everything look briefly, improbably gentle. The stone bench against the south wall had a journal open on it. The 23rd, its cover new, its pages beginning to fill. Both their handwriting was in it now. His entries on the dates that had always mattered, and hers alongside them. A different hand, precise and fine, the hand that had illustrated 19 volumes of botanical work under initials no one had connected to her name until the night she turned around in a fog-bound exhibition room and found him already looking. Honoria's blessing had been given in the spring. Cautiously, with conditions that were entirely reasonable, and which Isabel had accepted without objection. The courtship had been conducted in full view. Letters sent rather than hoarded, calls made and recorded in the social pages. The whole ordinary visible machinery of two people who had decided to stop being private about something that had been private long enough. The lamp inside the house came on while they were still in the garden, one of the household lighting the rooms against the coming dark. Neither of them moved toward it immediately. The evening was warm enough to stay a little longer, and there was nothing urgent. And the journal was still open on the bench between them. And they had, at last, the particular unhurried quality of people who have stopped counting the time they have left and started simply using it. After a while, they went in together, and the garden held the last of the light a little longer before the dark came down.